And other large-scale projects have also made key interventions, and there are a few examples on that slide. The French of English was always a deliberately narrow term, as the project website explains. The French of England is a term originally designated to challenge any easy equations of England with English and to create more attention to a large strand of England's multilingual culture. Our new term, with its restriction to England, is designed to suggest that British Frenches cannot be adequately considered through English perspectives. If there's a French of England, there are also Frenches of Wales, Ireland, Scotland, each having its own distinctive history, while also participating in the wider stories of French in medieval Europe. And so the aim of our conference and of our edited volume is to bring together specialists in medieval Celtic and French studies in order to take up this invitation extended by the French of England project to think about what the Frenches of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany and Cornwall might look like. What are their specific contexts, trajectories and dynamics? What methodological challenges and opportunities are at stake in them? And what might be their wider implications for the linguistic, cultural and political histories of our modern regions and nation states? So drawing on the wealth of existing research on French in these areas, as well as new analyses and insights, we hope that the volume will enable the Celtic worlds and also Celtic studies to enter this interdisciplinary conversation more fully, with a view to expanding, enriching, and where necessary, challenging scholarship on medieval francophonie. So that's the kind of big picture publishing pitch for the project. And aside from lots of editing and organising, my own contribution to the volume actually starts on a much smaller scale, and that's with the opening scenes of a 13th century Arthurian prose narrative known as Berlevaux, or Le Haut Livre du Graal, which, if you are all sitting comfortably, I shall relate to you now. So, Berlevaux begins with Guinevere lamenting Arthur's descent into idleness. She's not very happy about this, and so she instructs Arthur to visit the chapel of St. Augustine in La Blanche Forest, where he will be counselled by God, who will grant him the desire to do good in the world once again. Arthur agrees to this mission, and also after a bit of hesitation to Guinevere's suggestion that he be accompanied by a squire, Arthur selects the squire Caus, who's the son of Ivan Lampitt. Arthur tells Caus to sleep that night in the hall and to prepare his arms and horses early the next morning. Caus agrees and even sleeps in his clothes in order to be ready the next day. As soon as Caus falls asleep, he dreams that Arthur has left without him. In a blind panic, he grabs his sword and rides off in pursuit of the king, eventually arriving at a chapel where he thinks the king might have stopped off to pray. He enters the chapel to find not the king, but the body of a knight laid out on a litter, covered by a silk cloth and surrounded by 4 golden candelabra. Caus decides to take one of the candelabra and rides off to continue his pursuit of Arthur. When he's back on the road, he encounters this large, kind of evil-looking figure who's armed with this big 2-sided blade. Caus asks him if he's seen the king. The figure replies that he has not, but that he's pleased to have found Caus because he knows about the theft of the candelabrum and orders Caus to give it back. Caus refuses, and he says that he intends to give it to Arthur. The two clash, and the knight plunges his knife, we're told, up to the hilt into Caus's right flank. And we're then told that les valets qui jouaient à la salle à Cabrel, qui s'y au songier, s'éveilla et cria à haute voix, Sainte Marie le pourvoir, aidiez, car je suis mort. Help, I'm dead. The king, queen, and chamberlain rush to his aid. They find Caus still in possession of the candelabrum, but with the blade embedded in his flesh. He asks to take confession, and then Arthur himself pulls the sword from the squire's body and Caus dies. Arthur then entrusts this candelabrum to the newly founded Church of St. Paul's in London, because he wants this marvellous adventure, cette aventure merveilleuse, to be known by all, and for all to pray for Caus's soul. And the next morning, Arthur sets out for the chapel, and this time he goes alone. So this whole episode plays on a series of absences and virtualities that nonetheless leave very tangible, traumatic marks on the narrative diegesis. Even within Carus's dream, attention is drawn to these kinds of originless impressions. As Carus races to catch up with Arthur, he follows the trace, is suit la trace of Arthur's horse, following what he believes to be its hoofprints. Et voit les esclos du cheval le roi se lui so it seemed to him. The text qualifies Carus's perception here in a bit of a nod to the ontological instability of the scene, to the gaps that are opening up between seeming and being. The phrase is repeated a few lines later, second quote there, when Carus spots a cemetery where there were many coffins, so it seemed to him. The coffins marking out another kind of trace that conceals its own origin in the body within. Even the materiality of the manuscript plays into this discourse of traces. The manuscript that's most relevant to what I'm talking about today is Oxford Bodleian Library, Hatton 82. I'll explain why in a minute. But the opening section of the codex displays noticeable worming. There's one hole, I don't know if you can, I've tried to mark it out in red over there. It actually begins way back in the fly leaves and penetrates as far as folio 20 in the manuscript. And so this vellum, like Carus's own body, is punctured by an agent whose existence is inferable only from its perforative traces. And in fact, the identity and ontology of Carus's assailant are also uncertain. How does he know about Carus's theft? We don't know at this point. Is he the same knight that Carus saw laid out on the litter, risen maybe from the dead? That's not. He does reproach Carus for stealing the candelabrum. He says you you stole the knight the candelabrum by which the knight who lies dead in the chapel was honoured. But this third person reference doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that they are still one and the same person. And it's not such an outlandish notion, this idea of the undead knight, given the otherworldly setup of the whole sequence. So Guinevere, when she kind of pictures this adventure, describes the chapel as a mysterious and dangerous place which one cannot find except by aventure, so kind of like adventure, but also chance, fate, maybe even. And she also says the place is very perilous, and the chapel is very aventureux. This opening sequence in some enacts a series of ontological slippages. It shifts into dream visions, and other worlds are abruptly short-circuited by the return to La Salle à Cardouel, the hall at Cardouel, and the death of this wounded squire. And those slippages are actually commented on in the text itself. There's this amazing exchange between Arthur and Carus, who's dying, and the king says, "Is this a dream then? Est-ce un songe?" And he says, "Yes, sire. But very grievously for me, it has come true." So perhaps most interestingly, from the perspective of the French and Celtic Worlds project, this episode, which is itself, as I've been trying to show, very invested in the imagery of traces and impressions made, whether in earth or flesh, by beings that seemingly never were. This episode leaves its own traces, its own textual imprints in perhaps surprising places. Most of the surviving manuscripts are fallible, but for one exception, which the Hatton manuscript, are linked with north and northeastern France or Flanders. It seems to be where the text was first made and circulated. But as scholarship has also long noted, the text seems to have circulated in the marches of Wales. In its earliest marcher manifestation, it's in the text known as Fouclefit Soirée, which is a romance narrative, genre is difficult, a narrative relating the history of the Fitzwarren dynasty of the Shropshire March until the death of Fulk III. The text notably covers the period of Fulk's outlawry from 1201 to 1203, after his claim to the castle of Whittington was rejected by King John. Fulk is preserved in London British Library Royal 12C12, where it was copied by the so-called Ludlow or Harley scribe in two phases. There are lots of theories as to why it's in two phases, from 1325 to 7 and 1333 to 5. That text, though, is a mise en prose. It's a prose version, probably made by that scribe himself, of an earlier, now lost verse romance, which dates to the later 13th century, possibly sometime in the 1260s. The second manifestation of the chapel episode in the marches occurs through translation. The Welsh text known as Saint Gael, or Historia Saint Gael, is based for the first part on the Caisse del Saint Val and for the second on Perleval, though the text may also indicate familiarity with other French sources, notably the Prose Lancelot and Prose Merlin. Its earliest manuscript witness is on the slide there. It's National Library of Wales, Pennaeth 11, from around 1380, where it's copied in the hand of Hywel Vychan, who's one of the main scribes of the Red Book of Hargest and related manuscripts. The Red Book being Oxford Jesus College 111. Pennaeth 11 is likely the first fair copy of the translation that was made. Saint Gael was probably produced in association with the Uchelwr Hopcyn ap Thomas of Ynys Forgan and Swansea. Hopcyn is elsewhere identified by Hywel as his master, and together with his brother Rhys, he commissioned Welsh adaptations of several contemporary Latin and French language texts. And these two texts, Fulk and Saint Gael, have their own afterlives, of course. Possibly in the late 14th century, the verse version of Fulk was adapted into an English verse version, probably an alliterative one. That's now lost, also lost, but it was summarised in around 1540 by John Leland, who, and he tells us that since that book, by that point, already lacked a quire or two, he supplements his synopsis with a verse version from French. Perhaps the one used by the Harley scribe himself, or a variant version of it. Saint Gael, meanwhile, was copied at least once in National Library of Wales 3036E, and was sought after across Wales, as is indicated by the often cited poem by Drychiolaethau'r to Shahian ap Ieuan of Pentrosfordios, asking him to lend his Grail book, i.e. Pennaeth 11, to David ap Ieuan, abbot of Crucis. It's unclear just how exactly the chapel episode in Perleval makes its way, ostensibly from northeastern France to Shropshire and Ynys Forgan. Though scholars have traced a few possible trajectories. First one relates to Glastonbury, and it relates to a fragment of an insular French copy of Perleval from the first half of the 14th century, which was discovered at Wells Cathedral in 1986. James P. Carley suggests that the fragment might originate in Glastonbury Abbey, where the Chapel of St. Augustine episode was also adapted by John of Glastonbury in his Latin Chronicle of Glastonbury Abbey around 1342. Carley suggests that Glastonbury could have owned a now lost continental copy of Perleval for some time prior to the production of the Wells fragment and of John's Chronicle. If so, then that could maybe account for the episode's circulation in mid-13th century Shropshire, as Anne Salomon and Patrick Moran have noted. It might also account for the Welsh transmission. It's been argued that Welsh writers in the Southern Marches had access to Glastonbury materials. John's Chronicle itself actually is the likely source for the reference to the chapel episode in Darogan yr Olaf Bendigaid in Pennaeth 50. So maybe the composition of a Saint Gael can be viewed as a slightly earlier example of that Glastonbury connection. Another avenue for the Perleval's March and reception relates to Hatton 82, which is a mid-13th century Perleval manuscript, probably produced in northeastern France or Flanders. But on folio 1, it contains the ex libris of Sir Brian Fitz-Allen, which you can read on the top of the screen there. He's Lord of Bedale in North Yorkshire, who died in 1306. And Nitzer and Jenkins, the earlier editors of Perleval, suggest that he may have brought it back from the continent. It did then later transfer to another Fitz-Allen family, the Fitz-Allens of Oswestry, as indicated by one of the later inscriptions. It's really blurry there. But that later inscription is Thomas Arundel est bonus puer. And that's probably Thomas Arundel, son of Richard Fitz-Allen, he later became Archbishop of Canterbury. And that connection to the Oswestry Islands brings the manuscript much more firmly within the networks that are surrounding however, it's not known when that exchange of Hatton 82 between the two families took place. Nitze Jenkins suggests that it could have happened while the two families were participating in the Edwardian conquest of Wales. If so, then it would just about coincide with the composition of the verse book. But Salomon and Moran have pointed out that the exchange could have taken place at any point prior to this inscription. In fact, access to this manuscript might not even have been necessary for the allusion as it appears in Fouque, which I'll show you in a second, because it gives it's quite short and it gives very broad narrative contours, so it could very well be based, they say, on memories of a tale read or even heard in a social occasion. And for all that the surviving Parler-Romani witnesses, so Saint-Gréal, the Wells fragment, and Hatton 82, they do appear to be related philologically. None is a direct copy or translation of any of the others, which suggests the circulation of now lost intermediary manuscripts, such as the one notionally held at Glastonbury. I have elsewhere, when I've written about this, described these kind of obscure trajectories of the chapel episode as what Jane Gilbert, Simon Gaunt, and William Birdwinkle have called dark networks. And they use that term to designate those substances, quote, those substances, relations, and forces that may shape a text or manuscript and the trajectories it follows, while leaving on the primary materials no traces that are directly detectable using present methods. I think that analogy still holds, because as compelling as the evidence of Hatton 82 and the Wells fragment might be, we do still remain completely unable to retrace how, when, or even why, or actually even if, in the case of Fouque, this text circulated in the marches. I do wonder, though, if and this was sort of prompted by when I went back to read this episode, and so kind of prompted by its own interest in traces and ghostly ontologies, if there are other ways of conceptualizing not just this episode itself, but also its textual traces, and indeed the imprints left by Francophone literature more widely upon medieval Welsh cultural landscapes. And for this, I've turned to theories of hauntology, which is where the spectres come in. Hauntology is by no means a recent innovation in critical theory. The French term anthologie was coined by Jacques Derrida in his 1993 work, Spectres of French. Riffing on the spectre of communism evoked at the opening of the Communist Manifesto, Derrida's aim was to conjure certain spectres of Marx and of Marxist critique at a moment marked by widespread neoliberal triumphalism following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR. Beyond this immediate context, though, Derrida's work has been widely influential on the so-called spectral turn in cultural studies during the 1990s and 2000s, with various disciplines continuing to explore and further expand the theoretical terrain. So it's playing on its near homophony with ontology. Derrida's ontology acts as a foil to, even a ground for, ontology's privileging of and reliance on being and presence. By contrast, Derrida describes the spectre in this way. Il says, c'est quelque chose qu'on ne sait pas, justement, et on ne sait pas si précisément cela est, si ça existe, si ça répond à un nom et correspond à une essence. On ne le sait pas, non par ignorance, mais parce que ce non-objet, ce présent, non-présent, cet être-là d'un absent ou d'un disparu, ne relève plus du savoir, du moins plus de ce qu'on croit savoir sous le nom de savoir. On ne sait pas si c'est vivant ou si c'est mort. Does not know if it's living or if it's dead. So the spectre kind of hovers then between and beyond established ontoepistemological categories. It's something that both is and is not, and also neither is nor is not. The spectre is kind of like the Derridian notion of the trace, the trace, the mark of a presence that's always already absent. So my contention in this chapter is that in its different manifestations, the Chapel of St. Augustine episode both thematizes and then in its march of dissemination itself instantiates a kind of haunting that resonates with Derrida's writing on the spectre. So the chapel sequence in Saint-Gréal is a fairly faithful rendering of the episode in Parlez-vous, which is in line with wider trends in Welsh translation practices in the 14th and 15th centuries. Like Caws, Gaunt believes that he's following the hoofprints of Arthur's horse, and he too sees the chapel, as in Parlez-vous, both moments of perception are qualified by the text. We have this line, Herwydd the Begev or Herwydd the Begev, as he supposed. Sengreal also lingers on the troubled boundary between dream and sleep. In both texts, we're explicitly told that Caws goes to sleep. So in Parlez-vous, it's Livalet Fukoshir, that's why we sleep. Aguasa Aithikoski, the boy went to sleep. And also, as in Parlez-vous, the scene abruptly cuts back to the sleeping squire in Arthur's hall at the moment of the injury. So we have here Cynna Aguasa Chonoid and Cysgu'r Aneuad and Carllion, a Defroes ac Agria o Hitiben. So the boy who was sleeping in the hall at Carllion awoke and cried out at the top of his voice. Arthur arrives at the same, and the same exchange happens, in which Gaunt claims that he's been dreaming and is mortally wounded. And Arthur says, "Is it that you were dreaming?" And the king says, "Yes, but I've been wounded for good, forever." In sum, the Welsh translation pays the same attention to the imagery of traces as does the lost source, of which it is itself a trace. In Fulk, though, the allusions to the chapel episode, like I mentioned earlier, they're much less wedded to any nominal source, though both coincide with moments of heightened hauntological significance. The first occurs in the opening section when Payne Peverell, who's a cousin to William the Conqueror and a Fitzwarren ancestor, defeats the giant Gogmagog, who's been reanimated by an evil spirit and is occupying a great castle called Chestiel Bran, so possibly Castell Bran, which is now known, we're told, as La Belle Marche, the Old March. Once he's been defeated, Gogmagog tells Payne that in his time, all this country was called the Blanche Lande, the White Heath, and he describes it as a space that they've kind of closed off with walls and a ditch, and they hold like jousts and tourneys. They have a great time. And it was full of mauvais esprits, so evil spirits, and those who went there seeking marvels were never allowed to leave. Until that is, Augustine arrives and he starts baptizing people and makes a chapel, which caused us many troubles. Gogmagog then delivers this verse prophecy concerning a wolf, descendant of Payne, who will chase the boar from the White Heath or the Blanche Lande and will be threatened by a leopard. He will travel from the woods and mountains into the sea and encircle this island, eventually to regain his land. Which is essentially the plot of Fulk of his Way. The second, more extended allusion to the chapel episode actually bookends that episode, and it appears again in another prophecy, this time one attributed to Merlin. Reprising Gogmagog's earlier imagery, the text now explicitly identifies the Blanche Lande with Blancheville, i.e. Whittington, which is the holding that's kind of been in contention the whole romance, and identifies the wolf with Fulk. I won't read the whole thing, but you've basically got a kind of potted synopsis there of the episode in the chapel of St. Augustine, where Caws stole the candelabrum, then was injured by a man with a knife, wounding him in the flank, and then he wakes to find himself actually wounded. But it's notable that both occurrences of the chapel episode in Fulk coincide with prophetic utterances that speak to the very phrase which governs much of Derrida's inquiry in Spectres of French, which is Hamlet's assertion that the time is out of joint. The first emergence of the chapel episode in the text coincides with a scene of multiple hauntings, in fact, of Gogmagog's body by this spirit, and through him also of the Marcher landscape by a series of pasts, pre-Norman, pre-Saxon, even pre-British, which once conjured can never be fully exercised. On the contrary, actually, as several scholars have argued, this prophecy serves to inscribe the Norman polity in cycles of empire and exile. And indeed, the burial of Gog body in a pit outside the town, to me, reads like a kind of anxious instance of Derrida's account of exorcism as a performative act that primarily seeks to reassure itself. He says, it's on the slide, no. He says, for nothing is less sure than that what one would like to see dead is indeed dead, which is why we're told that they put Gog outside of the town and they try and bury him. If, though, Gog prophecy foretells a future which the narrative will go on to realise, then that realisation culminates in another prophetic citation of that same future, which is the second chapel reference. So by this point, the prophecy is actually already fulfilled. So it's kind of like Carius crying out that he's already dead. The prophecy acts as a kind of future past that's kind of retroactively realised by the narrative itself. And so this narrative is haunted not just by the pasts of Britain, but also by its own past narration by this point. And also in their form, of course, as couplets, presumably retained from the verse romance. These prophetic moments throw into relief the text's own status as the impression of a lost original, its prose haunted by the couplets it both evokes and overrides. So hauntology then is I think it's a fruitful way of reading this episode, in Père Livre itself and in the texts that it haunts. But more than this, the critical attention that hauntological approaches draw to the spectral traces in and of texts recommend them as a way of thinking about the impressions left by Francophone literary culture more widely on medieval Wales and the March. And this is why I'm kind of coming back to the French of the Celtic Wales material. One of the major advantages of hauntology is that it provides a framework for thinking through gaps and silences, traces and impressions that point to, but that can never bring to be what once was, what is not yet, or what might have been. And so hauntology is a useful tool for critical analyses of power. Derrida himself frames his attention to ghosts as deployed au nom de la justice, in the name of justice. He says that speaking of, to, and with ghosts is necessary for any politics or ethics that claims that takes seriously its responsibility towards those who are no longer or who are not yet. And in her influential Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon, I think kind of quite dialectically to Derrida, frames ghosts in slightly less redemptive terms. She calls them a repressed or unresolved social violence, but which nonetheless, as in Derrida, constitutes a politico-ethical call to action. She says they produce as something to be done. So hauntology alerts us not just to absences, but to the exclusionary mechanisms and power asymmetries that produce them. As Lisa Blackman puts it, hauntologies are also histories of the present, of how particular presents have materialised in relation to specific and contingent normative horizons, and what's relegated, excluded, disavowed, or consigned to pathology. And I think that the cultural landscapes of medieval Wales and the March arguably lend themselves quite well to this kind of hauntological analysis. As scholars have shown, French was used in multiple contexts, especially in urban centres across the Marches, and French language literary texts circulated in gentry monastic networks across the region. But there survives from medieval Wales relatively little written evidence, particularly literary evidence, to exemplify the point directly. So we don't, for instance, have any surviving exemplars of the Guest and valuable material of St. Cleat, let alone for the prose Lancelot or prose Merlin that they also kind of allude to. We know, for instance, from a very often cited post-mortem inventory, apologies if you've seen this 100 times, that the Glamorgan rebel, Llywelyn, who died in 1317, owned Un Roman de la Rose, just owned a Romance of the Rose. but it too doesn't survive, or at least we don't know which copy if it does survive. Sorry, I'm going backwards now. Nor do we have any of the kind of direct exemplars for French-derived or partly French-derived texts, from Peredur, Owain and Geraint to Canol Land, Peredur Charlemagne and Otiel, to Balmohamtwn, to the Welsh Bestiary, to Seithdoedd o'n Rubein, the Hysmonaeth, Derhebion, and Historia Adar. And for all that scholars strongly suspect David ap Gwilym's acquaintance with French language lyric, and in particular Le Roman Blaroise, there is as yet no concrete evidence for direct borrowings. And that's not to say that French isn't in all of these things. It's just that it's not kind of positively proven. Many of the reasons for this scarcity of primary evidence are undoubtedly political. So on the one hand, as Helen Fulton has underlined, Welsh remained a prestige language in Wales, even after 1282, and so it wasn't displaced by French in the way that English had been in post-1066 England. It's possible that as much as uchelwyr such as Hopkyn ap Thomas sought to participate in contemporary literary vogues, they felt no need to consume that material in French, and preferred just to commission translations into their own language. On the other hand, though, wider power asymmetries between Welsh and English institutions must also play a part. As Daniel Hughes and Cynydwen Lloyd Morgan have discussed, the survival rates of Latin manuscripts from Welsh monastic libraries are remarkably low, in large part due to the destruction and dispersal of books during the dissolution. Wales had no university to recover monastic holdings in the way that Oxford and Cambridge could, and many monastic books were acquired by more powerful institutions in England and the borders, such as Hereford and Worcester cathedrals. Monastic books also took more circuitous routes to these kinds of repositories through the libraries of antiquarians and collectors, such as Sir John Bryste, a royal commissioner who acquired over 100 manuscripts and printed books from the marches in southwest England. I know, because I'm entering them all into a database. Both Hughes and Lloyd Morgan illustrate the extent of these losses with reference to the Registrum Angliae de Libris Doctorum et Actorum Veterum from 1320, which lists 242 books on theology at Margam Abbey in Glamorgan, none of which is identifiable with the 3 extant manuscripts which are now thought to survive from Margam, one of which is contested. So although they were probably likely fewer in number to begin with, manuscripts containing French language items would have been similarly impacted by all of these factors. We know of a few such books that were produced or circulated in monastic contexts, but lots more might have become lost or become untraceable. Beyond the monasteries too, surviving manuscripts in Latin, French and English are very rarely considered to have been produced or circulated in Wales, unless they also contain Welsh language items, glosses or marginalia, or other indications as to places of production and provenance. So things like scribal or institutional identifiers, textual indicators, ownership inscriptions, correspondence to external catalogues, but lots of these are quite rare in Welsh contexts, as Lloyd Morgan has discussed. So to summarise, there are high rates of manuscript transfer and loss, coupled with the difficulties of identification and localisation, mean that even if French language manuscripts had circulated or been produced in Wales, we know that they were circulating in Wales, it's unsurprising that they don't survive, or that they don't survive with sufficient evidence to demonstrate their Welsh origin or provenance. So what emerges from medieval Wales in the March, in other words, is a landscape as haunted as the chapel of St Augustine itself. Viewed through the prism of surviving texts and manuscripts, French language sources like Derrida's Spectres flicker into view, sometimes quite clearly, sometimes temporarily, blurrily, as if in animal closeness. The solidity of their ontological contours ranges from the relative certainty of once extant sources for translations, for close translations, like St. Gael, to vaguer allusions to narratives that were perhaps well known, perhaps half remembered, as in the verse prophecy of Fouque, to the more nebulous kind of influences of sources that maybe never were, of cultural trends and mobile motifs whose precise trajectories are now irrecoverable. But as Derrida insists, we must learn to talk to spectres. And I'm very happy that many of the scholars involved in the French of the Celtic World project, and of course lots of scholars who aren't, have shown how to speak to these spectres with admirable eloquence, working backwards from the translations, allusions, interpolations, oblique references, and extra-textual records that do survive in order to exhume this ossified ontology of a vibrant, multilingual world. And so the purpose of kind of theorising French in Wales, the March, and other Celtic territories in this hauntological way is by no means to undermine those conversations, nor is it merely to labour an apt metaphor. Hauntology enables us to find value in these spectres on their own terms. It doesn't problematise the spectre as a lacuna to be filled, an absence yet to be made present. Rather, it allows the spectre to problematise the present and that which has been made absent from it. Our spectre's silences, as hauntology warns us, are often the echoes of violence, of conflicts, colonisation, and the coalescence of political and socio-economic inequalities. For Welsh and other Celtic contexts, hauntology highlights that it's not just the medieval presence, but also the post-medieval absence of French that index asymmetrical relationships with power. And as hauntology also teaches us, such spectres are not only the traces of what was, to varying degrees of certainty, but also of what might have been. They remind us of the contingency of our present normative horizon, to borrow Blackmore's phrase. For our purposes, they remind us, they show us that there's nothing inherent or inevitable about the Anglicisation of Wales and other Celtic territories, which have always been and still are marked by linguistic and cultural diversity. And finally, hauntology reminds us that these spectres call, as Gordon insists, for something to be done. They invite us to think more expansively, I think, and critically about our own methodologies, their potentialities and limitations, their norms and assumptions, about our own disciplinary boundaries, models of training, and the nationalising narratives of cultural and linguistic history that have for so long shaped them. And indeed about the ways in which we can most usefully participate in and also disrupt an overwhelmingly Anglophone scholarly landscape. The spectres don't necessarily give us solutions, but like the hoofless tracks in Carous's Songe Averès, they perhaps show us a way. Thank you.